afternoon, Rotarians.
Good afternoon, Kevin.
Hi, Kevin.
Hey, you guys are getting better and better, thank you. Yes, I'm Kevin Kissier, president of the club. It's continues to be an honor to be the president of the Rotary Club of Des Moines in our last meeting of August. Thank you to Lynette Rasmussen for being our greeter today. Be sure to sign up for that opportunity for future meetings. As I mentioned early on in my tenure, we weren't going to do the foundation Tumblr events every week, but periodically I would talk about foundation topics, and today's an opportunity to do that. So our $50,000 community grant, yes, we voted. It's up from $40,000 previous years, up to $50,000 this year. Thank you all for your support to our foundation. The application is available on our website. It's due, the final cutoff is due Friday, September 6th. So if you know anyone looking for that, a nonprofit looking to put together a proposal, that has to be in by September 6th. And yes, it's really due to the credit of all of you continuing to give to the foundation. And just a little advertisement, since we have so many guests today. Our club is really blessed with a foundation of $2.5 million now, over years and years of support, contributions that allows us to make that $50,000 annual gift, and other gifts to students for scholarships, teachers, police officers, firefighters, and on and on. So it's really a great strength and benefit to be a part of this club and have that foundation behind us. Now I'd like to introduce Susan Voss, who's going to come up with and do our moment of inspiration, and then lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, four-way test, and then we'll get an opportunity to greet each other. Susan?
I was trying to think of some words of inspiration about the economy and economists, and it just started. Other than my checkbook is balanced, I think. Anyway, so I wanted to maybe perhaps some lighthearted moments of inspiration. So a mathematician, an accountant, and an economist apply for the same job. The interviewer calls the mathematician and asks, "What does 2 + 2 equal?" The mathematician replies, 4. The interviewer asks, 4 exactly? The mathematician looks at the interviewer incredulously and says, "Yes, 4 exactly." Then the interviewer calls in the accountant and asks the same question. "What does 2 + 2 equal?" The accountant says, "Well, on average 4, give or take 10%, but on average 4. Then the interviewer calls the economist and poses the same question. "What does 2 + 2 equal?" The economist gets up, locks the door, closes the shades, sits down next to the interviewer and says, "What do you want it to equal?" And now, please stand, pledge allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now the four-way test. Is it true? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Nice to meet you.
Kevin?
Buddy?
Good to see you, buddy.
Yep.
Thank you. See you again.
All right, thanks everybody. I now have the privilege of introducing our guest today. We have a number of guests, which is fantastic. First, I'm going to introduce two folks who are in the application process. This is the last time we'll introduce you as guests, and next time, I'm sure you are our members. So I'd like to ask Sue Tempero and Jen Miller to please stand. We have also today Mary Mosman, the Director of the Department of Revenue and Finance. We have John Coons, CFO of Henning Companies. We have Mike Myers, a John Deere Group Product Manager for Global Application Equipment. We have Cindy Snell, the wife of Mark Snell, and they are celebrating their 40th anniversary. That's exciting. And we have Todd Wiedmeyer, owner CEO of Iowa Des Moines Supply, guest of Bob Bedwell. Welcome, everybody. All right, we are on to my little segment of Did You Know? And
Yes.
I'm going to do a little different one this time. For those who aren't familiar, I usually give little tidbits like last week, what is the technical term for the little blob of toothpaste on a toothbrush, and it's a nurdle. You didn't know that. But today I'm going to do a little different history story. My son-in-law was telling me he's a bit of a Civil War buff and a good writer. And we were chatting, and he was telling me about the Civil War story. I said, that would be really good for a Did You Know segment. So this is a little different. I'm going to read his write-up. So this is a little tidbit from history that reminds us that fate is not without a sense of irony. In the summer of 1861, after months of skirmishes that followed the assault on Fort Sumner, which marked the kickoff of the Civil War, the forces of the North and South finally met on a field in Manassas, Virginia, in what would be the first major battle of the conflict, the Battle of Bull Run. The farm on which the two opposing armies collided was owned by a businessman named Wilbur McLean. Wilmer McLean, that's Wilmer right there. His house was commandeered by the Confederates for use as a headquarters during the engagement, and a Union cannonball actually landed in the family's kitchen. After the battle, Wilmer decided he had had enough of the war already and decided to move his family and farm further south, far away from where he believed the hostilities would be able to touch them. However, fate had other plans. For you see, the town to which McLean moved was Appomattox, Virginia. The house he bought was actually the former courthouse, and there's the house right there. And on a cool, damp morning in April 1865, and in that house served as the location where Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of North Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant, thus effectively ending the Civil War. So Wilmer McLean was rightfully able to say the Civil War began in my front yard and ended in my parlor. And then a little prologue that I just did a little research. I always research these things, right? I want to get a set just to be sure that what I'm sharing to you is accurate. Just a little tidbit. Once the ceremony was over, members of the Army of the Potomac began taking tables, chairs, and various other furnishings in the house. Essentially anything that was not tied down as souvenirs. They simply handed money to the protesting McLean as they made off with his property. Major General Edward Ord paid $40 for the table Lee had used to sign the surrender document on, while Major General Philip Sheridan took the table on which Grant had drafted the document for $20 in gold. Sheridan asked George Armstrong Custer to carry it away on his horse, and the table was presented to Custer's wife and is now on exhibit at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. So a little more of the story. Now we will have our Rotarians on the floor laughing segment, and I'm pleased to once again welcome to the podium Skeet Wooten.
Thank you. You guys are so underwhelming. Unlike Kevin, we don't aim for accuracy in this, but this is the first weekend for college football. And everybody has their favorite team, like the Iowa and the Iowa State. Okay. Sorry, what was that again? Okay. I didn't realize they had that. Anyway, so we have a few schools that hopefully you'll know the answers to these questions, what their mascots are. If you went to Lindenwood University, you would be a
Woodchuck.
good guess. Wrong, but a good guess. You'd be a lion. Okay, how about Murray State? Seriously? Racers. Okay, we'll do an easy one here. West Carolina.
Hilltoppers.
No. Catamounts. I'm gonna quit. I mean, this is just. Okay, let's see. Tulsa, University of Tulsa. Golden.
Hurricane.
Very good. We have a winner. Tim Lillowitz. One of my favorites, the Elon University Phoenix. They used to be the Fighting Christians, but we know why they changed the name. And okay, we'll close with this one. University of Delaware. Okay, that's part of it. What's Fighting Blue Hens? Tim Lillowitz, you win the prize. Okay, so there you go. That's it.
All right. Thanks, Keith.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I think I made a mistake earlier on. I forgot one of our guests, so I apologize. Jen, I apologize to you. You brought your husband, Joel. Joel, please stand. Let's welcome you as well. And now Scott Bennett will introduce our program. Scott?
I have the pleasure of introducing Robin Anderson to our group today, and Robin is the state economist, and with your Civil War reference, from the great state of Iowa. How about that? So Robin and I knew each other from principal. We worked together for about 9 years, and what I remember most about Robin is that we had the task of, principal has an investment committee every week, and it's chaired by Dan Houston, CEO that's spoken before this group, and other senior execs. We had the pleasure of going through weekly updates. I did a markets update, Robin did an economics update, and that was through good and bad times, right? And so one of the things that always impressed me about that is that to your joke earlier, Susan, it wasn't our experience that the economist was able to get away with, hedging a little bit here, but the specificity that they demanded or desired as part of that process. And so Robin, we'll probably put you on the spot a little bit today for what's going on in Iowa in that regard, but fond memories of our time at Principal together. Robin has her BA degree from the University of North Carolina, PhD from the University of Washington, so very well traveled from a collegiate standpoint. She did spend some time at the U.S. Census Bureau, but please help me in welcoming Robin Anderson to the podium.
Before I get started, can you all hear me okay? In the back? Okay, awesome. Well, I am here to talk about Iowa's economy. I'll give the good and the bad for all of us. I'm going to give you a little bit about myself.
In the meantime, Tar Heels and Huskies.
Yeah. I should have known Western Carolina and Elon because I'm from North Carolina. That's a disclaimer because I work for state government. Pardon me. A little bit about me. As Scott Scott mentioned, I worked at principal before coming to state government. I started in March 2020, which was a fun time to start a new job. March 13th, to be specific, to leave my old job and come to my new job, and I was immediately sent home 3 days later. I'm a transplant to Iowa. I was born in Pittsburgh. I grew up in North Carolina, go Tar Heels, and then I was a Husky. But my parents are from Iowa and got married at the student union at Iowa State. And this came full circle. My husband is a philosophy professor at Iowa State. We have an 8-year-old son, a cranky old dog, and we just got back from Colorado from a hiking trip. This is a picture my husband drew of our family. You can see me, my husband looking very professorial, my son who has a little bit longer hair now, and my cranky old non-Dalmatian cattle dog who has a tendency to nip. So I am going to provide first an introduction of Iowa's economy, tell you a little bit about what's going on in Iowa, how the U.S. kind of translates and trickles down to the Iowa economy, the U.S. economy. Then I'll compare the U.S. economy to the economy nationwide so you can get a benchmarking about how we stand up compared to the U.S. as a whole. Then I'll talk about 3 key sectors of the Iowa economy: manufacturing, farming, finance, and insurance, which you're probably all familiar with. Then I'll talk about migration, because one of the long-term drivers of the overall economy is population growth. So it's not only births and deaths, but who's coming and going, who's coming and leaving from the state. When we think about Iowa's economy, we're interest rate sensitive and commodity price sensitive. So we move, our GDP moves a little bit more around, if you remember GDP output, a little bit more bouncy than the US as a whole, and they're headwinds right now. We've got high interest rates, some good news, interest rates are likely moving down, but low commodity prices. However, Iowa's labor market is traditionally tighter than the US as a whole. We have typically, and I'll get to this in a moment when I show, I'm an economist, so I have charts. I apologize if you don't like charts, but I've got a few. Iowa's unemployment rate is typically lower than the US as a whole, and that's even during downturns. And our participation rate, which I'll define a little bit later, is typically higher than the US as a whole, so we've got more folks working and our unemployment rate is lower. There are a lot of things going on in the US economy, so how does that affect Iowa? And I think of 3 things happening in the US economy: what's going on with interest rates, what's going on with inflation, and what's going on with activity. We've been in a period of high interest rates, maybe not as high as when my parents were buying their house, but certainly elevated interest rates, and that's been a headwind for farmers in terms of interest expenses, home buyers through higher than usual, when I say usual, over the last few years, interest rates, challenges for the mortgage refinancing industry, and challenges for small businesses, which are more likely to take out loans than larger businesses. But the Federal Reserve, if you follow financial news, is in the process of lowering interest rates. Depending on the magnitude of the cuts and how that trickles down into auto loans and mortgage loans, that potentially will help farmers, businesses, and households within the state. The other thing that's going on is inflation. We went through generationally high inflation in 2022, and that erodes real incomes, keeps expenses higher for farmers in terms of feed expenses and fertilizer expenses, among other things, and also may deter spending for households. Inflation is coming down, though. That's the good news, and that's going to help boost real incomes for Iowans and help lower some of those expenses for farmers, small businesses, and manufacturers. Activity growth. There's shifts in U.S. activity growth. In particular, the labor market looks like it's about to slowing down. If we do see a slowdown in demand in the U.S. and globally, that's going to affect our exporters, including farmers and manufacturers. So when I think about Iowa, and when I compare Iowa to the U.S. as a whole, I think about the sectors. This is a pie chart that shows all the sectors of the Iowa economy and a pie chart of the U.S., which shows the sectors of the U.S. economy. And we all know that we've got an outsized farming sector, but we also, you're probably familiar, we've got an outsized manufacturing sector, one of the biggest manufacturing sectors in the country. And we of course have, as I know from working at Principal, but others in the industry, insurance industry, we've got an outsized finance and insurance industry. When you compare to nationally has outsized information and professional and business services relative to Iowa as a whole. So it's that industrial mix that helps me build up a narrative about what's happening in the Iowa economy and where the economy might be headed. This tells you a little bit, if you remember from macroeconomics, GDP, output, inflation adjusted, or real GDP, going back to the college years. Hopefully you didn't fall asleep in economics. This chart shows you a story about recent history and Iowa activity versus US as the whole. Iowa is in blue, the US is in black. In 2019, we were a bit softer than the US as a whole, and that's in part because of a downturn in commodity prices. So we had that weak period of commodity prices in the mid-2010s. Then we actually did pretty well to the US as a whole. We contracted, but not as much in 2020, likely because our state opened up more quickly than other states within the United States. We had a little bit better rebound in 2021 as well. But we actually had a couple periods of softer GDP. We look at 2022 and the first half of 2023, that was actually driven by weakness in the financial services industry, likely related to market movements and interest rates. However, over the last couple of quarters, we started to see weakness trickle down to the agricultural sector with lower commodity prices, in particular for corn and soy, and that's also hitting our agricultural manufacturers. This chart shows a longer period of history, and I put for fun recession shading in gray so you can see the downturns in the economy. Going back to 1980, again, Iowa is in blue, the US is in black, and there's a couple things I'd like to point out. First of all, the definition of the unemployment rate is the number of people that don't have a job, but the key is they've got to be actively looking for work, divided by the labor force, which I'll get to defining in a little bit. Iowa's unemployment rate, as you can see, even during those recession shading periods, is lower than the US as a whole. And right now we're steady at 2.8% unemployment rate, even as the unemployment rate has picked up nationwide just a little bit. Still pretty low nationally, but it has moved up. This chart shows our labor force participation rate, and this is another measure of the health of the labor market. The labor force participation rate is the number of people without a job and actively looking for work, plus people that have a job, divided by essentially the adult population. So there are a lot of people that don't have a job but are not in the labor force. You can think about college students, retirees, your son that is in your basement playing Grand Theft Auto, aging myself right there, or stay-at-home parents. I don't know if I mentioned that. Iowa's participation rate, you can see in blue, has traditionally been tighter than the US as a whole. We've got a tighter labor market in part. This is consistent with what we see with other Midwestern states. We've just got a little bit tighter labor market and more people working. However, you see that sliver of the COVID recession. We had about a 70% participation rate prior to COVID, and that really hasn't recovered. In fact, over 56,000 people have left the labor force since December 2019 here in the state. And it's dropped in part because we've got more retirees, in part from our demographic composition, but also some demographic shifts within the state. This chart shows you, if you're a nerd like me, I follow the jobs report coming out on the first day of the month for the US as a whole, and I definitely remember that at Principal. Jobs Day was always fun, or not fun, depending on what the report was. So you can follow jobs here in Iowa, and you can see as the US as a whole, we've seen a little bit of a downward trend in our job growth. We have seen some positive signs, in particular for healthcare, as that still recovers from COVID. Leisure and hospitality are also recovering from COVID, but we've got some headwinds in something called professional business services, I believe professional business services, but also headwinds in the manufacturing sector now. These are the weakest and fastest growing sectors over the last 10 years. So you can see where where we're growing and where we're losing jobs, and we can build up a narrative about automation. Administrative and support services has seen the biggest job declines. This makes sense because this is data entry, bookkeeping, all the types of things that are being replaced by automation. Durable goods manufacturing, we've lost some jobs over the last 10 years. This is in part driven by automation again, also driven by trade wars and that downturn in commodity prices in the middle of last decade, pardon me. We've seen an uptick in education services, construction, which I'll get to in a moment, commercial and industrial construction, and then non-durable goods manufacturing, which includes food processors. This chart shows over the last decade construction. I thought this is a really interesting chart because you can see the boom in construction jobs after the pandemic. This is not housing related construction, this is all commercial and industrial. You probably see this as I get lost in Des Moines with all the road closures on Ingersoll, which is good news for the future, but a little bit frustrating right now. That is related to federal stimulus. So we've seen construction jobs actually hit a high going back to 1990 recently. The next 3 slides, I'm going to drill down in a bit of text about what's happening in agriculture, what's happening in manufacturing, and what's happening in finance. In terms of, we're outside ag state, but I thought it was really interesting in terms of aggregate gross income, not on a per capita basis, but on an aggregate basis. We have only behind California in gross income, but of course California is, largest state. I'm not sure, maybe Texas is larger, but California is the largest state. Farming drove real GDP growth when we saw that boom in commodity prices after the last couple of years, but now we've seen commodity prices fall. When I think about falling, I think about corn and soy prices. So now it's been a drag on activity. The decline in commodity prices is not necessarily related to demand, but more supply. Weak receipts, focusing on corn and soy receipts, along with high interest costs and high input costs. So if those costs go down, that's going to be good news for farmers, are expected to translate into lower national farm income this year, according to USDA forecasts. Farmland values have been incredibly high, but we are seeing some normalization. If you look at Farm Credit Services of America, we saw farm values tick down a little bit for the first time in 5 years, but they remain quite elevated. And I just listed the prices of corn and soy compared. You can just see the magnitude of the decline over the last couple of years with the downturn in those prices. But I do want to emphasize that hogs are doing a little bit better. They were very weak, and we see consistent strength in beef. Manufacturing, as I mentioned earlier, we're outsized manufacturing state, but we've got some headwinds right now. In particular, the theme is in ag manufacturing. Sorry to say this, but John Deere, there have been a lot of challenges at John Deere, laying off about 1,600 folks. Also, Kenzie Manufacturing, another equipment manufacturing. Bridgestone is a supplier for some of the ag manufacturers, but we heard about Perry's, Tyson plant closing, and also Smithfield packaging closing. Even though we've seen some of these closures, some of this is showing up in the data that we follow, but not yet. The unemployment rate has still stayed at 2.8%. More layoffs may come depending on the magnitude of the downturn in the commodity cycle. Finance and insurance, there have been some challenges. I'll definitely be curious to hear from the folks in the finance and insurance industry to see if I'm getting this right, but what I've read has seen some challenges in part related to what's happening at Wells Fargo, also automation and increased premiums, but there is some good news. If you look on an incremental basis in terms of jobs and GDP, we are seeing a little bit better numbers coming out of the finance and insurance industry. Here you can see a sharp growth up in finance and insurance and kind of a slow and steady decline, but a little bit of pop up over the last couple of months in the sector. I'm going to switch gears and hopefully give you an idea about migration into the state and why that matters. What drives, when we think about, economists think about long-term activity growth, inflation-adjusted real activity growth over the long run that's driven by productivity, but also labor supply. And labor supply is related to how many folks we've got living in the state. You can get population growth from births, deaths, sorry, it's a little bit dark, but also net migration, so who's coming to a state and who's leaving the state. This chart shows net migration for Iowa, and you can see the fall off in migration during the collapse, the farming crisis in the 80s, kind of a leveling off of net migration. But the other thing I want to point out is international net migration is really what's supporting overall net migration for the state. So who's coming and who's leaving the state? We can actually look at tax data from the IRS, so a little bit of tax data out there. Don't worry, it's aggregated data, so it's not revealing anybody's personal information. But you can see who's leaving the state. They're going to places where everybody else is going. They're going to Florida, Texas, and my home state of North Carolina. And who's coming to this state? Well, it's our neighboring states, Nebraska and Illinois, but I thought it was interesting that a lot of people from California are moving here. So there could be this trend of people moving away from the coastal states, coming to places like Florida and Texas, but also coming here to the Midwest. And then the last chart, I've shown a lot of charts. The last chart I'm gonna show you shows you the ages of people, how people move based on their age. And this looks not only at people moving from different states, but also people moving around the states and moving abroad. People that stay in the same house from a year ago, including myself in my old historic home that keeps on collapsing. People that live in the same house from a year ago are older. That makes sense. You've got a job that you've probably had for a while. You may have some kids. You're gonna stay put. Then people moving within the same county or different county or from a different state are younger. They're moving for their first job or going to college. A lot of people coming from the state are coming to our fine universities like Iowa State, Drake, Iowa. I named both Iowa and Iowa State. I'll put in Northern Iowa as well. To go to college. But one thing I want to point out is people coming from abroad are older than people coming in from a different state, suggesting that they're coming here for work. So you've got this difference in behavior between people moving from a different state and then people moving from a different country or moving from abroad. And to go full circle, to give you some takeaways from this presentation, Iowa's economy is a little bit different than the US as a whole. It behaves a little bit different in part because we are more interest rate sensitive and more commodity price sensitive. So it means there's more volatility and activity, in part because of those drivers: manufacturing, finance and insurance, and farming. Our labor market is tight, which means we typically have an unemployment rate lower than the US as a whole, which is great news. But the challenge is our participation rate, or the number of people who are working in the state, is declining. That aligns with challenges with population growth, which are ultimately going to be the big drivers of overall economic growth for the state. But we could see some good news as we see some people flowing into the state, in particular from coastal areas. So hopefully I gave a somewhat balanced picture of Iowa. I'm excited to be in the state and learn about the state as I become the state chief economist. So I will open up the floor and go to the next steps. Yes?
ITR Economics out of New Hampshire is predicting a Great Depression in 2030 due to the debt of nations. Where do you see 6 years out or 5 years out?
So for the U.S., I think there's definitely some challenges. We've got an aging population. Both sides of the aisle don't want to deal with our rising debt or rising deficit. I think it's quite interesting right now that we've actually seen a tick up in our deficit, which typically only happens in downturns. That happened in 2023. I thought that was interesting and a bit worrisome. The challenge with debt or debt to GDP ratios and deficits is it crowds out private investment. So I think the challenge going forward is, will we see a slowdown in the economy as debt government debt crowds out private investment? And is there a risk? So I followed this when I worked at Principal, debt downgrades. The US is a safe haven asset, but if we continue to see elevated debt to GDP ratios is another thing that I follow, and elevated debt deficits. Don't think this is likely, but will we see the US no longer be a safe haven asset?
Thank you.
Yes?
I've been around a while and didn't know there was a state economist, so how does the expertise that you bring and all the data that you analyze, how is that used by the state level?
Sure, so we do something, and I'm gonna get a little nerdy here, so bear with me.
You're among friends.
We produce revenue forecasts for the state, and that is used, and pardon me for getting wonky, by the Revenue Estimating Conference, which sets the budget for the state. I also do briefs and provide guidance to members of the executive branch, including staff of the governor, and I come around here or other places if people are interested or invite me, and I do presentations to talk about the state economy. And in addition, my team does fiscal estimates for the state. So if we want to learn about tax cuts or tax increases, how much is that going to add to the state general fund, or how much of that is going to take away from the general fund, which is the pocket of the dollars that we can spend as a state. Yes?
I recently heard or read that the school voucher system this past year was 18,000 students left the public system and went into the private schools. For this year, that's jumped to 30,000. And with each kid that leaves, $7,800 of tax money goes with him or her to the private school. Knowing the economy of Iowa as you do, is there any way to get more money back into our private or our public school system?
So I think I don't want to run into the line of talking the political here. I'm a neutral party. I think it will depend on things like property tax and how much money that the state is able to allocate to private schools and other types of local taxes to be able to devote to the public school system. I do think it's interesting though, if you look at trends in private school enrollment prior to when the voucher system was put in place, they were pretty steady or in fact declining a little bit based on some of the research that our team has done. So that was interesting, and I think it'll be interesting to see what private school enrollment will actually be and how much private schools increase or decline tuition based on these new vouchers. Yes?
So we hear constantly about inflation and how it's affecting the prices of various sectors that we all spend money in all the time, but then if you look up corporate profits in all those same sectors, almost all of them are up leaps and bounds. A lot of people call it greedflation. I guess, what are your thoughts on that? And quite frankly, why in the world do we not talk about it?
That's a great question, and you're exactly right. Corporate profits are almost at record highs on a nominal basis. I think the challenge is that consumers were still willing to buy at high prices. So people continue to buy, not substitute to other goods, but continue to buy at high prices. So corporations were not changing behavior. In addition, what I think is quite interesting is you saw, even as corporate profits were going up, we went to a period of high nominal wage growth. So even though there was profitability, they were also we saw wages go up, eating into margins, but those margins still staying elevated, which I thought was really interesting as well, even though real wages were going down. I think you had your hand up first, or who had their hand up first? Okay.
Is that me? Is that age before beauty? So does your office do any drilling down of sectors or segments in the state? Because we certainly have pockets of cities and urban areas doing very well, and then we have counties where it's gotta be a desert. So how far down do you drill to see how is our economy affecting some of our parts of the state?
So we do provide information about sales tax in different states, different parts of the state. So you can look at behavior and people's spending across different communities. That's one way we look at it. I certainly look at the state as a whole. Our Iowa Workforce Development Division is very focused on areas of high unemployment. You look down in southeastern Iowa versus Story County and Polk County, and how essentially Iowa Workforce Development can help those counties with those relatively high unemployment rates. Yes.
So in terms of, is ag production classified as agriculture or manufacturing?
So the way that NAICS, I'll say NAICS codes, but if you look at John Deere, if you look at Tyson's Perry plant, food processing plant, those are considered manufacturers. But when you look at farm, essentially the farm itself, that's considered agriculture. If you look at Corteva, that's not considered agriculture. So there is a split between what's manufacturing, chemical manufacturing, food processing, ag equipment, and then actually on the farm or the co-op.
So I guess my question is, isn't potential, if we're gonna have low commodity prices for a long period of time, the impact really is maybe larger than just looking at egg production. by itself.
Exactly, and there's gonna be if you look at, I think the example of this is if you look at, John Deere, I think it's Kenzie, but if you look at Bridgestone laying off, so it's the suppliers of these agricultural manufacturing companies that should be watched as well to see how that kind of trickles down the supply chain. Who had their hand up first?
So when you're talking about population tracking, and I was about level, I think the metro's up maybe 100,000 people in the last 10 years. What does that mean for the other parts of the state that are more rural? And if we do this for another 10 years, are there some economic concerns about what the rest of the state is gonna look like?
Sure, I think this points to your question as well. So I think the challenges that you see, not necessarily a lot of people coming, there are people coming to the state, but a lot of the movements into Polk County or Dallas County are coming from people within the state. So you see this trade-off between what's happening in rural areas, what's happening to rural school systems, compared to the booms in Waukee and West Des Moines, or even, I wouldn't say, Des Moines is a little bit different than the suburbs, and then there's also a challenge, I think, if you look across the state in housing affordability, and I think that's exacerbated in rural counties as well. Who else had their hand up? Yes.
Going back to the reserve currency idea and its impact potentially on Iowa, especially because of our global importance, I guess I'd say. What concerns, if any, should we have about the BRICS movement and the idea of potentially shifting away from the dollar as a reserve currency? And what impact potentially do you see coming down the road on Iowa agriculture or other commodities that we sell abroad because of that change and the changing status of the dollar as a reserve currency?
Sure, I think if we did see some weakening of the dollar, so we've got strength in the dollar, but weakening, that would on the margin, certainly benefit our exporters. However, we are seeing, it's really gonna depend on China, I think. If China is able, and there have been a lot of expectations of China that haven't come to fruition, but if China is able to push to ultimately become the reserve currency, and then they're able to control trade, then I think that's gonna be a problem for our exporters. And you're already seeing China switching away from buying from us in terms of our agricultural output to other countries. Did that get to answer your question?
Yeah, in fact, you brought up another point that I really hadn't thought of in regards to China. But part of the concern, I think, with that deals with China's stability. Because there's a lot of other economists who are saying China's in trouble.
I agree with that statement. I think they've definitely, high expectations of China have not come to fruition. And you see other challenges for other developing countries as well. And now it feels like India is kind of the country where you see the high expectations.
Is it not true that China's debt to GDP ratio is higher than ours, especially if you include private debt? Because so much of the Chinese miracle was based on real estate, which, you know, they have huge cities that are completely empty, where they built all this stuff.
I think there are challenges, more significant challenges with private debt in China than we have here. I think the statistics, if I recall from my old hat of being a global economist at Principal, the statistics out of China, they certainly do close the door and say, what do you want the number to be? So it's hard to believe the statistics out of China, but I think if you're able to kind of drill down and look at the true economy in China, I think there's significant problems, as you mentioned, with vacant cities.
And their population is aging much
Yes.
greater than ours.
And they're getting away from the one-child policy failed, essentially. I don't know who had their hand up first.
I did. You mentioned the increase in Iowa's nominal wage rate, but I'm wondering how our wages compare nationally today.
I think it depends on the sector, but typically because of the low cost of living here, we do have lower nominal wages, if that makes sense. And if you look at some sectors, like, I think one example I pulled out is nursing. We're definitely not as competitive as other states, which is a challenge to retain nurses within the state. Yes. I think, who had their hand up first?
Okay. I just want to verify, on one of your slides, it looked as if, and it was a bar graph, that Nebraska was like double what Iowa was, and I can't remember the category.
Was it this chart? That chart has Nebraska.
Correct.
Okay. So that chart shows folks from Nebraska coming into the state of Iowa. Is that what you were getting at? Is that what your question is about?
Yeah, represent.
So this shows the number of people coming versus going, subtracting going versus coming from the state, and shows that we have a net 417 people, at least in 2022, moving from Nebraska to Iowa. Does that make sense?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. So outflows and inflows. So you've got inflows, people moving into the state, versus outflows, people exiting the state. And you subtract outflows from inflows, you get net inflows into the state. And you can see that we had a net inflow of 417 people coming into the state from Nebraska. So there were more people coming into Iowa, 417 more people coming into Iowa from Nebraska than leaving Iowa to go to Nebraska.
One more question.
Sure. Yes.
So, Robin, thank you for your presentation today. It was excellent. You made a comment regarding the demographics and the age tendencies to stay in their lovely homes, especially in established neighborhoods. I'm just kind of curious, who is your favorite neighbor?
The neighbor that let me use their driveway to take down my walnut tree.
Thank you. All right, Robin, thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. It was a great presentation, and thank you for all the work you do for the state of Iowa. Mary, thank you as well. welcome again. Thank you for all the work making this state a better place. Okay, next we have upcoming meetings and speakers. So once again, our program committee is doing a phenomenal job with great speaker after great speaker. So next we have Terry Wallach, the CEO of ChildServe. On September 12th, we have author Enfys McMurray, author of the book Disaster at 39,000 Feet. A little background on that, in the 1960s there was a major disaster of a plane exploding over Iowa, right, Dave?
Yes.
And so this is a fascinating book, according to Dave, and so you don't want to miss that one.
Whatever that tells you.
He's a trustworthy guy. And then the next one is another CEO of Hoyt Sherman, Robert Warren. So think about a guest that you can bring to those meetings and let Kitty know by 9 a.m. on Wednesday. Right, Kitty? Upcoming events, but before we do that, we had a coffee Tuesday morning fuel event. We hit our number, over 20 of us attended this past Tuesday at Freedom Blend Coffee. It was a great conversation at in a more casual setting, and the speaker was Paul Schickler, our own Paul Schickler, former CEO of Pioneer. So it was fantastic. I want to keep the momentum going. So the next one, we have our own Lynette Rasmussen's going to be the headline Rotarian to speak to us, former CEO and currently the Culture and Community Officer at the Rasmussen Group, who has 11 companies under management under that group. So looking forward to that. That is, put it on your calendars, September 17th, 9 o'clock in the morning, Freedom Blend. Let Kitty know, because we're the good news is we're starting to fill all of our seats so we can get more seats, more chairs in the room if we need to. So put that on your calendar, 9/17 for our next coffee get-together. Also, upcoming events. So the Thursday, September 26th, we will not be here, but there are two opportunities that week to get together. The first one is the evening of September 24th, which is the Des Moines Multi-Club hosting their 8th annual event, the Civitas event. Opportunity to connect with other Rotarians, other guests, and the topic is on human trafficking. It is $25 per person at the West Des Moines Hilton. And also on Thursday, September 26th in the evening, I see Becky here, who was the visionary of the Thank Fall event last year, and I definitely want to continue that this year. We're going to do exactly the same thing. We just hope to make it even bigger with more folks coming. So it was a wonderful thing last year. If you didn't come, they had What You Smoking Barbecue. We'll have again drinks, music, 5 to 7 at the Jester Park Nature Center outdoor patio area. It is a beautiful setting if you haven't been there. And this is an opportunity to bring spouses, partners, guests. We had kids, families are welcome to come. It's a great spot for the kids as well. It's a beautiful evening. Get that on your calendar. And Evites went out just this past day or two, right, Kitty, to sign up for that. So please put that on your calendar. And lastly, again, there's our pillars. Think about what you can do on our 3 strategic initiatives of building relationships within our club, growing membership, and making a community impact over the next week. Have a great week, everybody. A special thanks to all of the guests. Thank you for coming. Have a great, safe, and happy Labor Day. We are adjourned.